from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, strike in the Strait. President Trump says the U.S. must respond after accusing Iran of shooting down a U.S. Army helicopter near the Strait of Hormuz. This just after Trump said a deal to halt the fighting was close, with a ceasefire holding barely. And Washington's stalemate. Democrats threatening to block renewal of warrantless spy powers over President Trump's pick of Bill Pulte as acting spy chief. Speaker Mike Johnson heading to the White House today to press the president for a path forward ahead of a Friday deadline. We've got the latest from the Hill this hour. And primary tests. Voters heading to the polls with primary elections today in 4 states. In South Carolina, a test of President Trump's grip on the Republican base. And in Maine, Democrat Graham Plattner said to be nominated for Senate, but many questions about his past could complicate the party's effort to unseat Republican Susan Collins. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And, Joe, we begin tonight with President Trump's declaration that the U.S. must respond to an Iranian attack on an American Apache helicopter shot down over the Strait of Hormuz. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is joining us from the White House live with more. So, Tyler, what could that response look like, and when could we see it?
Well, Kaylee, at this point, we don't have an immediate indication on what this U.S. action would entail, though we know that there are a few options on the table, including that the U.S. could target military sites in what would be a major escalation. The U.S. would go after perhaps infrastructure or energy sites. But we should keep in mind here that the U.S.'s response will probably be proportional to what happened once the final report about this incident is released. Because I will point out that earlier today, Iran's foreign minister in a post on X didn't deny that Iranian forces were involved with the downing of this American military helicopter, but seemed to indicate that perhaps the incident was unintentional. Thankfully, as you mentioned, it does appear that both of the pilots on the helicopter are safe and were not harmed. And I bring that up because over the weekend, President Trump was pushed on what his red lines would be in order to end the ceasefire. He mentioned if Americans were killed in any such attack, or if he felt that a deal could not be reached or reached quickly, in his words. Now, this White House has long maintained that diplomacy is their top priority as they push for a deal, even after we saw the worst flare-up in fighting earlier this week between Israel and Iran. At this point, we have to see where these negotiations go. A person familiar with the matter does confirm to us here on Bloomberg News that the talks are ongoing. They are expected to continue this week, and they remain, quote, intense, as Pakistan is the main mediator. But Joe and Kaylee, we did get a little bit more of finer details on where these negotiations are headed after a New York Times report released earlier today seemed to indicate that the two sides are zeroing in on 4 areas related to Iran's nuclear program. That includes a potential lengthy moratorium on uranium enrichment, with the New York Times reporting that U.S. officials believe that that ban could land at around 15 years.
Really interesting, Tyler, if that in fact becomes the basis of an agreement. I just want to go back to the rescue of these 2 airmen who went down on the Apache helicopter, said to be rescued by a drone boat, an autonomous boat, a first for the U.S. military. Is that right?
Right. According to the U.S., this would be the first time that such a rescue has taken place. It is putting this heightened scrutiny on exactly what Iran's military capabilities look like and how the U.S. has been responding and also bolstering up its own presence when it comes to this region. Of course, there has been so much focus on the Strait of Hormuz, as that still remains a very fragile part of this ceasefire. Iran really hasn't backed down when it comes to tightening its grip over the waterway, but neither has the U.S., as President Trump has vowed that that U.S. naval blockade is going to remain in place. In fact, earlier today, Centcom did confirm that the U.S. hit an empty oil tanker that appeared to have links to the Iranian oil trade. But Joe and Kaylee, we should also point out that we heard earlier this week from another Iranian-backed proxy group, the Houthis in Yemen, who are now threatening to ban any Israeli ships near the Red Sea. Their statement didn't extend to all commercial shipping, but we do know that it poses a wider threat, considering this key corridor in the Red Sea is considered to be a bypass route to ships that cannot transit through the Strait of Hormuz.
Fascinating. Tyler Kendall reporting from the North Lawn of the White House and putting together all the elements today. Tyler, thank you so much as we follow action tonight on Capitol Hill as well. The House right now is set to vote on a reconciliation bill that was approved by the Senate last week, would end months of back and forth over funding for immigration enforcement. With us now for more, live from Capitol Hill, Jonathan Tamari from Bloomberg Government. Jonathan, when do we think the voting will begin?
Well, as we speak, a procedural vote is unfolding right now. And as soon as that's over, the House is going to move right on to final passage of that bill. So within minutes, they should be moving on and starting the final voting on that. And the expectation, based on how things have gone so far today, is that that will finally move to the White House for President Trump's signature. And this weeks-long dispute over immigration enforcement funding will finally come to an end, and Republicans can turn their attention elsewhere.
Well, perhaps turn their attention to reauthorizing Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Those key government spy powers, Jonathan, obviously are due to expire on Friday, and it doesn't seem like they will be extended so long as Bill Pulte is still in the Office of Director of National Intelligence in an acting position. This is something that the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, talked about today, the notion that some certainty around the DNI is going to be the thing that unlocks FISA. Can this move forward without someone nominated to the permanent position?
It doesn't look like it right now because there's opposition to FISA from the far left and the far right. And so it's always required kind of the middle of both parties to come together, which means a fair share of moderate Democrats have to vote for it. And they're saying that they are not going to vote for this as long as Pulte is in this position. They don't trust him. He currently leads the Federal Housing Mortgage Agency. He has used inside information there to try to stir up prosecutions against some of President Trump's rivals. And so they can't even begin to think about what he might do if he has access to intelligence information. And Democrats are saying they're not going to back down. So Thune's off-ramp here is for the president to nominate somebody else who would take over permanently to give Democrats some assurance that Pulte is only in there short term.
Well, to that end, Jonathan, Speaker Johnson reportedly at the White House to meet with the president this afternoon to talk about this. Will he ask Donald Trump to have a permanent name ready to make lawmakers feel more comfortable about this?
It's not clear exactly how far Johnson is willing to go on this. Thune has been the one who's been a little bit more outspoken as far as trying to get a change in the president's conduct. Johnson, I don't believe, has talked to reporters since coming back from that meeting, so we don't know exactly what he went there to urge, but that is seen as the most clear off-ramp and a way to get FISA done either this week or very shortly after.
All right, we'll have to see. Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari, live from Capitol Hill. Thank you so much. And now to get back to the news that broke this afternoon as President Trump suggests that the U.S. will respond to the downing of an American Apache helicopter over the Strait of Hormuz by Iran. We're joined now by retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, the former destroyer squadron commander in the U.S. Navy and now a senior fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Admiral, thank you for being here on Bloomberg. As you consider how the U.S. might calibrate this response, how critical is it to know whether or not this was intentional on the part of the Iranians?
Yeah, I mean, I think because they're firing something across the strait, whether it was intended to hit the Apache or intended to hit something else, it's highly likely that it was a kinetic weapon being shot across the strait. So I think the president's right that he has to hold them accountable. The real question will be, as your reporter, she properly stated, is this going to be a proportionate response or a disproportionate response? I'm hoping that the president sticks to the same advice he gave Benjamin Netanyahu, I believe, over the weekend, which is don't do it, but if you do it, be proportionate. Because we're trying to prevent this from getting out of control while we keep a lid on these so that we can get to a negotiated settlement on the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. How do we define proportionate in this case, Admiral? Iran's not flying around Apache helicopters to do an eye for an eye here. What would work for you?
So I think a proportionate response in this case is before, when they fired and not hit Americans' ships, our ships have shot down the drones and missiles over. Last week it happened in 2 different occasions. What we did was proportionate strikes against the sites that fired at us. So in this case, what I would do is the sites that fired at us, plus maybe where we know stowage to be, command and control to be, maybe additional radar sites, things that weren't directly involved in this, in a drone launch or a missile launch, but are still of a kind, military in the Bandar Abbas or Strait of Hormuz area. So a thick strike, but not a strike that escalates into, if you start striking economic targets, then that would be an escalation, disproportionate escalation. So I'm hoping he keeps it to military targets in the Bandar Abbas area.
But even if he does keep it to those things, Admiral, would it constitute an end to the ceasefire? Can we even still credibly call it one?
Well, we had last week. They fired twice at two different sets of occasions, and we struck back in a very, very proportionate way. I mean, the president's trying to keep a lid on it, and I think that will determine. Hopefully that will gauge his response in this one. He's going to shoot. He said he was. I think he's generally on these kind of issues kept his word within about 24 hours. So I expect a strike, tonight, in the dark, in the darkness in Iran that's starting right now, and at some point in there, and then hopefully we'll keep it proportionate, military targets only, maybe slightly larger than we did last week.
Admiral, do you believe the American people are receiving an accurate portrait of what is happening in the Strait? The ships that are actually passing through, as the Energy Secretary suggested today, increased flows. I've had some folks suggest on the air that there is no blockade. Do we actually know what's going on?
So there are two blockades. One, we are blockading Iranian fossil fuels from getting out. I think, generally speaking, that's working. Do I think small movements happen where Iran gets to another Iranian port, Iranian ship might get to a Pakistani port, never leaving territorial waters potentially? Those are small potatoes. The big ships going to India and China are being blocked. I think a small number of Western ships are coming through the Southern Transit Scheme, the one closest to Oman, with general guidance from the U.S. on what's a clear, mine-free path. We call it a Q route in the military, and with some level of overhead support that has recently shot down a number of missiles and drones probably headed at those ships, and things like these Apaches and A-10s up to shoot down small boats. And to the degree that there are very few small boats coming out at these ships now. But those are small numbers, and the Secretary's averted that. What's getting big is the pipeline passes. I think both the UAE pipeline to Oman and the Saudi cross-peninsula pipeline to the western part of Saudi Arabia are both going, probably getting near their maximum capacity as they pump around the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, and as we consider those alternate routes, it raises the question about whether or not the Red Sea is still going to be viable, given the threats we saw from the Houthis against Israeli vessels, in particular after the firing between Israel and Iran in the last few days. Admiral, we saw the struggle we had militarily with the Red Sea when the Houthis did this a few years ago. Would we be able to maintain the blockade and deal with a challenge like that in the Red Sea if it were indeed to get to that point?
I think that would tie up more ships, but the Navy's able to do that. Again, the head of the Navy would tell you there's a time limit on doing all these kind of operations and doing more at the same time, saying the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the straits by Yemen where the Houthis are, will, put more of a demand signal on the Navy. We might be able to strip some ships from the carrier strike groups, things like that. The point is, ships will be able to flow through there. The U.S. can protect ships against, escort ships individually, big, large VLCCs, that's the 2 million barrel carriers through the Strait of Hormuz. If they come out, if they're piped, if it's piped across, if there's a pipeline across Saudi Arabia, that's coming down. So I think we can do, I know we can do that. And the Houthis were weakened significantly by strikes we in Israel did last fall and the loss of their benefactor. Iran provided them with the parts necessary to build a lot of their drones and ballistic missiles. That delivery pipeline has been hollowed out by the United States over the last 2.5, 3 months. So the Houthis are a threat. I don't believe they're determinative, and the Bab el-Mandeb is a much easier strait to maintain open than the Strait of Hormuz.
I want to ask you about the rescue operation quickly while you're with us, Admiral. Pretty remarkable to see an unmanned boat, a drone boat called a Corsair, retrieve these two people out of the water. What we're told was a first for the U.S. military. We're showing some video of that unmanned craft right now on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. Did we just glimpse the future, Admiral?
We did, and I've glimpsed this future a few months ago. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine with their military forces, and the Ukrainians have been using ground drones, like what look like little John Deere tractors, pulling carts behind them to load their wounded and sometimes dead and bring and retrieve them from the battlefield. So unmanned vehicles doing this in the battlefield is not new. Doing it at sea is really unique, and I have to give Central Command a lot of credit. This minimizes the risk to your CSAR, your combat search and recovery forces, by having this go out and pick them up. Now, obviously, the pilots need to be in good shape. You need to understand they're in good shape. There's a proximity issue. Usually a helicopter can be brought up to do this, but if you don't know how they were shot down, this might have been the great alternative if the timing was right in terms of the Corsair being in proximity, the pilots both being in good physical condition, which they clearly were, because you have to clamber on that thing. At least one person has to be in very good condition.
Can't imagine. We are living in very interesting times. Admiral, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, we thank you as always. We turn to Wall Street now. Markets managed to close well above their lows after tumbling in the wake of the headlines today from Iran. The Dow Industrial Average closing higher, up a fraction of a percent, but the broad indexes still finished in the red. As we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins us live from New York. Nora?
Well, investors heading for the exits today, at least as it relates to the tech space. So we did see the S&P 500, NASDAQ 100, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average seeing some pressure. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average up by 0.2%. But take a look at the NASDAQ 100 down about 0.3%, or excuse me, the NASDAQ 100 down 1.1% and the S&P 500 down 0.3%. But I really want to dig into the market breadth because we did see about 370 names in the S&P 500 to the upside, 130 names lower. But what you were really seeing dragging down that index, at least earlier in the session, was a lot of pressure coming from chip makers. So we saw 9 sectors in the green, led higher by real estate and utilities. But the 2 sectors in the red, tech and energy, really weighing on these major indexes. The NASDAQ 100 earlier falling more than 4% in the cash session, and of course closing lower by 1.1%. But investors are really grappling with headlines that they're seeing in the market. Trump saying that the U.S. must respond to Iran's attack on a U.S. helicopter, that really filtering into market decision making. And of course, in the bond market, keeping an eye there as well. Treasuries climbing, yields falling across the board. I'm digging into the policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield, hanging around 4.1%. The 10-year yield at nearing 4.5%, and the 30-year Treasury yield just below 5%. But of course, we know the culprit still is the semiconductor index. I'm looking at the SOX index closing lower by nearly 2%, earlier down more than 8% in the cash session. Of course, this comes after a surge that we did see for the sector that had it on track for its best year since 1999. So a bit of that fading. Investors still digesting that strong jobs report that we got last Friday, and looking toward tomorrow, we're going to get CPI and Thursday PPI here.
Indeed, we will. All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. A bit of breaking news to mention in the markets. Supermicro is up with a $7 billion equity offering it's planning. We got another one of these to fund AI. They say they've received $39 billion worth of orders for AI servers in recent weeks, and this equity raise is in order to fund that. That stock is sinking about 10% in the after-hours trade. But some more breaking news we just got from U.S. Central Command as it pertains to that U.S. response to the downed Apache helicopter. Centcom is saying that U.S. forces began launching self-defense strikes against Iran at 5 p.m. Eastern time today. So just about 20 minutes ago at the commander-in-chief's direction in response to yesterday's downing of a U.S. Army Apache helicopter. CENTCOM says the mission is a proportional response to unjustified Iranian aggression. Again, describing this as proportional and being a self-defense strike. So we'll continue to follow that here on Balance of Power. As we also follow what's happening in domestic politics, still ahead, we'll talk about the fact that it's primary day across 4 states today, including closely watched contests in Maine and South Carolina. And we'll have those details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
met with Graham Plattler today. We're going to beat Susan Collins and take back the Senate. We're going to beat Susan Collins and take back the Senate. We're going to beat Susan Collins and take back the Senate. Any other subject you got? Any other subject?
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And that was Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer last week fielding questions about oyster farmer and Democratic Senate candidate Graham Plattner ahead of today's primary race in Maine. Plattner's campaign has been dogged by a series of controversies, and his own former political director this week wrote that he shouldn't be a U.S. senator. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Brooke Sutherland. So, Brooke, despite all of that, he's still likely to emerge from this primary day as the Democratic nominee. The general election, though, could be a very different story.
He is likely to emerge as the nominee, and that's because Maine Governor Janet Mills, who was Chuck Schumer's first choice for this U.S. Senate primary, suspended her campaign in late April, but she will remain on the ballot. And I think what we're really looking for tonight is what is that final margin of victory? Plattner will most likely win, but how close is Mills able to get, considering that she hasn't been actively campaigning for weeks now? If we see a significant percentage of voters choosing Mills, even given all of that, I think that will be a sign of a really big protest vote in Maine that I think will make Democrats even more worried about this race than they already are.
Well, but of course, Susan Collins, as the Republican incumbent, has reason to be worried as well, just given the kind of midterm tides, if you will, and the challenges of incumbency, especially with affordability issues around the war in Iran. Where is she polling right now against Plattner? And have we seen a change in recent weeks?
The most recent polls that we have show Plattner with a lead over Collins. Now, those were done before the latest round of reports on controversies over Plattner's past. Most prominently, a New York Times report that some of his ex-girlfriends found his behavior disturbing. Plattner has denied the most serious of the allegations in that report, including that he was physically rough with one of the women. Now, I think it will be really interesting to see how that changes. We've already seen from a super PAC aligned with Collins putting out advertisements focusing on the Reddit comments that Plattner made during that dark personal period after he left the military that are misogynistic and offensive, and really, really hammering those home. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that fares over the next couple of months. Do people start to think differently about Plattner when that is constantly in front of them and they're reminded of the scandals, or have they decided that they're okay with it and they're willing to still vote for him? I think that's what Democrats are concerned about, is that that is going to be the strategy that Republicans are going to deploy. And the risk is that there's more damaging information that could yet come out on Plattner.
Brooke, thank you so much. Our Boston bureau chief, Bloomberg's Brooke Sutherland, handling one state in one race for us. Maine, though, is just one of 4 states holding primaries today, with North Dakota, Nevada, and South Carolina also voting in our view. And it's the race for the Republican nomination for governor of South Carolina that's getting a lot of attention in Washington tonight, with another Trump endorsement on the line. For more, we go to Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton for her take on this. And Anna, this is a pretty crowded field. The president's made his pick in the lieutenant governor, Pamela Yvette, but you've got some pretty big names here. The Attorney General, Alan Wilson, 2 members of Congress, Nancy Mace and Ralph Norman, both at least at one point close to Donald Trump, businessman Ron Reddy. Who gets to run with the lieutenant governor?
Yeah, and that's what's make this so interesting, is just kind of the cast of characters you have and the way that they've campaigned. So all 4 of these main candidates that you named have been trying to narrow down on a specific section of the conservative vote in South Carolina. So you have Ralph Norman really casting himself as true to MAGA values. You have Pamela Yvette, who's aligned herself very closely with Trump, the person, obviously gotten his endorsement. You have Nancy Mace, who's made a name for herself, trying to advocate for more release of Epstein documents. And so you have each of these candidates trying to appeal to a certain type of conservative voter, and it's really started to reveal some of the fissures in the South Carolina Republican Party.
Really interesting. Nancy Mace and Ralph Norman both bring some baggage here, right? Nancy Mace because of the Epstein files, something that she pursued and has recently said is the only reason she didn't get Donald Trump's endorsement. And of course, Ralph Norman, well, he endorsed Nikki Haley. Does that mean they're both on the outs?
I think it was more of a battle to get Trump's endorsement right now in this current moment. Part of that was a redistricting conversation that has happened in South Carolina over the past few months. And then part of it also is trying to figure out which parts of Trump's agenda and which parts of kind of MAGA values appeal most to voters, and whether or not you can kind of elicit some of those and highlight some of those in these conservative campaigns.
Yeah. Anna, thank you so much. Happy primary day. Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton with us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll send it back to Kaylee Lyons. Kaylee?
Well, Joe, Federal Reserve Governor and former Vice Chair of Supervision Michael Barr issued a new warning on Saturday, criticizing bank regulators for what he says could, quote, threaten serious harm to the economy. In remarks at American University, Barr said, quote, the Federal Reserve has issued a number of regulatory proposals and made other changes that together considerably weaken bank regulation and supervision. I believe that recent steps by the Federal Reserve and other agencies will undermine the safety and soundness of banks and increase financial stability risks. Vulnerabilities that result from deregulation may not be apparent today, but they will result in problems that will build over the coming years. So let's get the view from another bank regulator. Travis Hill, the chair of the FDIC, is joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio. Mr. Chairman, welcome to Bloomberg. Thank you for being here. How do you respond to criticism like that and concern that perhaps the easing of regulatory burdens for big banks may go too far and actually create greater risk?
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I fully disagree with that characterization. We do have an aggressive agenda to reform our regulation and supervision of the banking industry, but we are trying to bring it to a balanced place. We want to make sure that our examiners are focused on the types of risks that are material to a bank's safety and soundness and to financial stability. If you look at Silicon Valley Bank, the Federal Reserve had a long list of supervisory criticisms when the banks failed. Almost none of those were actually relevant to the financial condition of the bank at the time that it failed. So we want our examiners focused on the actual material financial risks, and so that's what we're focused on.
Well, hence the reforms to the CAMELS rating system. I know the comment period just opened a few weeks ago when this was officially proposed. It runs through August. But can you give us a sense of what feedback you are getting to those changes, specifically the reforms to the management component?
Sure. So as you said, I mean, we just put out the CAMELS proposal. So, comments are just starting to come in. Most of the comments usually come at the end of the period. But the reforms to CAMELS is just one piece of several things that we're doing to reform supervision. And so the general spirit of all of this is to try to focus the attention on the fundamental financial risks and have less focus on process-related things around how those risks are managed.
Well, and how do you guarantee that changing your view of fundamental financial risks doesn't ultimately still lead to greater risks in the system? What happens, Mr. Chairman, if you're wrong?
Well, we're always trying to get the balance right between enabling banks to drive economic growth and serve their customers and communities, while at the same time making sure that they're doing so in a safe and sound way. Of course, we at the FDIC are the resolution authority, and so when banks failed, we're responsible for resolving them in an orderly manner. So we are always vigilant to downside risks, and we are always prepared in the event that we do have bank failures.
Well, and of course, when we consider bank failures when they happen, there's a cap on the deposits covered by the FDIC of $250,000. But there is a big legislative push to actually see that cap raised, specifically when it comes to business and non-interest-bearing transaction accounts. There's legislation put forward by Senator Bill Hagerty, for example, that would raise that to $5 million for accounts such as that. Do you see the need for that to help level the playing field between the smaller guys and the big ones?
Yeah, look, I think it makes a lot of sense that Congress is looking at this now. It's been almost 20 years since the last time that Congress raised the deposit insurance threshold. Historically, Congress has periodically raised the threshold over time. The percentage of deposits in the system that are insured has come down a lot over the past few decades. It was about 80% of deposits in 1990 were insured. Now it's more like 55%. I think that if we're talking about reforming deposit insurance, I think that having a new category with a higher cap from a public policy standpoint achieves more than just a straight raising of the cap. So I think the notion of trying to target a certain category of deposits, like Senator Hagerty's bill did, or proposed. I think that makes a lot of sense, and we've been closely engaged with his office and others on Capitol Hill on that.
Well, and it gets to this idea of competition and the smaller banks being able to compete greater. Do you see a need for consolidation to achieve some of that as well? And I wonder if you actually think the easing or the changes you're making on the regulatory side actually could pave the way to more M&A in the community and bank space.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, having a diverse banking sector with banks of a variety of different sizes and business models is very healthy. It's unique to the United States. That being said, from our perspective, we don't have a desired end state in terms of what the right number of banks are, what the right number of banks in different pockets of the industry are. I do think that having healthy M&A is important for a vibrant sector, and so we are working on some modifications to our merger review process to be faster, more transparent, more open-minded about merger transactions. I think the biggest piece to consolidation, at least since the 2008 financial crisis, has been the huge decrease in new entrants into the banking system. And so another thing that we are looking very closely at is how to encourage more de novo activity, to encourage more new entrants into the system.
As we consider new entrants in the system, there's obviously the question around digital assets as well, and specifically stablecoin rewards that the banking industry has a big problem with as we consider the future of the Clarity Act on Capitol Hill. How great is that risk in your mind that you actually could see deposit flight from banks due to these reward programs?
So that's a very complicated question. As a general matter, when a customer takes funds out of a bank account and puts it into a stable coin or into some other type of non-bank account, as a general matter, those funds don't leave the banking system. They just get redistributed because effectively it goes from the customer's deposit account to the stablecoin issuer's deposit account. If the stablecoin puts that into Treasury security, then it goes to whoever sold the Treasury securities bank account. And so it's basically moving from bank account to bank account to bank account. That being said, it is fair to say that there may be different risks associated with different types of deposits. And so that could still have economic and other impacts on the banking sector. So these are things that we are thinking very carefully about as we implement the Genius Act. And obviously, as you noted, Congress continues to debate this as well.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg. The chair of the FDIC, Travis Hill. Joe.
All right, Kayleigh, thank you. Anthropic, meantime, just a few hours ago, releasing the newest edition of its Mythos AI model, this time with guardrails that will block it from carrying out cybersecurity tasks. Now, this comes as the company races, of course, against rival OpenAI to go public and contends with an uncertain regulatory landscape. Bloomberg's Emily Chang sat down with Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei ahead of today's news to talk about that.
It's very funny to me how there's a particular group of people in the tech world in Silicon Valley. They started with a position of even having transparency around this technology, even export control. This is all, just totally, it'll apocalyptically destroy our potential to create the technology. It'll kill innovation. And then as soon as they see the first real danger, which I've been expecting all along, there's all this talk of nationalization and the government should just seize it. Come on, folks here. You're yo-yoing from the most extreme anti-regulatory, if you look at us the wrong way, you're destroying the industry, to, this completely communist, the government should grab it all. We need a more sensible, moderate approach.
You can catch Emily's full discussion with Anthropic co-founders Dario and Daniela Amodei on the Bloomberg original series The Circuit tomorrow, YouTube or The Terminal, or right here on Bloomberg TV. For more on the race between Anthropic and OpenAI and new developments on Elon Musk's SpaceX filing, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Mike Shepard here in our Washington bureau. Shep, thanks for being with us. When it comes to the regulations and the sort of battle between these two extremes, I'm wondering your thoughts on this, because this is a company that was deemed a supply chain risk by the Pentagon.
It really is a huge question right now. How does the government really view Anthropic? Because in the halls of the Pentagon, there's certainly a number of officials who want nothing to do with Anthropic anymore. And we've heard Emil Michael, the Deputy Undersecretary of War for Engineering and Research, say in this studio that it was time to move on from Anthropic and that they were actively seeking other replacements for providers of AI in the classified military space. But there was an asterisk to all of that from him. He also said that Anthropic did offer some capabilities in terms of cyber that remained appealing. So they really are trying to navigate where they want to use Anthropic still and how they can coexist peacefully on certain levels, even with that conflict that has been stoked over the safety guardrails that Anthropic was insisting on. And then, Joe, there is the question, as Dario Amodei brought up, of the government taking stakes in some of these frontier labs and how that would shake out. And we heard the president talk about it just last week. How that factors into the wave of IPOs we're about to see is a wide open question.
So who's going public first? And does it actually matter who comes to market first? Is the idea that there's not enough money to go around for everybody?
Well, that again is a huge question. It looks like right now SpaceX will be first in line. They are scheduled to price on Thursday. And then start trading Friday. That we know.
In terms of OpenAI and Anthropic.
Yeah, but OpenAI, what the race is. And so who goes then second? Because we have to think of SpaceX also as a huge AI play. Sure. They are also competitors and partners with a lot of the AI companies out there, including Anthropic. So you have to think about who would come first. Now, right now, based on the last private raises of money, Anthropic has actually overtaken OpenAI in valuation. Not by much. It's less than $100 million. But right now, Anthropic is looking at a valuation of about $965 billion. And the question, Joe, then is if you are third after SpaceX and then whoever comes next, where does that leave you? One way to look at it, our colleague Adam Ariema put in the money column today, is the marshmallow test. You know, for retail investors and even institutional investors, when is it the right time to get in? And then also for the companies themselves, is it the time, can they delay gratification? Can they put off? Do they need to see what the market is shaping up to be? Now, we've seen this downdraft in stocks, especially hitting some of the chip stocks, this past week. But when you step back and look at that ticker, the SOX, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, going back to January, it's still up 62%. And we are still seeing this wave of adoption. And that will continue to propel valuations and interest in these companies. So if you go second, fine. If you go third, probably fine, too.
Really interesting. So let's get to number one, and that's SpaceX on Friday. Reporting today, we already know that it's oversubscribed. That's been the story since before we even had a date. But it's continuing to attract additional demand, Bloomberg reporting, from institutional investors. Multiple times the available shares. The number of orders has increased even since Monday. What does that tell us about Friday?
Well, what that tells us about Friday is that the interest in what Elon Musk has to offer is, by and large, enduring. And we even heard Jamie Dimon during a J.P. Morgan event to herald the IPO, talking about Elon Musk as the Thomas Edison of our time. And, all right, that may be putting a little bit extra gild on the lily there, Joe, but people do, and especially on Wall Street, do look at Elon Musk as somebody who's bringing revolutionary change. And we've talked in this space, Joe, before about how he wants to look for ways to combine his rocket business with artificial intelligence, putting data centers in space, and then, his fever dream, his lifelong wish of actually colonizing Mars. Now, long way off, sure, but along the way, even if he doesn't catch perfection, he may actually grab excellence and then produce something that would be of lasting economic value in the process.
Really
and that
remarkable.
Explains some of the appeal and what we could be seeing on
Quite
Friday.
a prospectus. I just want to be here for the asteroid mining if we ever get to that. Shep, thank you, as always. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard with us in Washington. Coming up next, major breaking news. If you're just joining us, the U.S. is responding right now with new strikes against Iran, after the president says Iran downed an American helicopter near the Strait of Hormuz. This is the Apache that went down yesterday. Now the retaliation. We'll have much more next, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. And we're dealing with two breaking stories this hour. The House of Representatives just a few moments ago passing the long-debated reconciliation bill that was passed by the Senate last week. The Republican leadership is holding a press conference right now with Speaker Mike Johnson briefing the press. This is the $70 billion reconciliation package to fund ICE and CBP for 3 years, which passed 214 to 212 in the House. Also, we're getting news from Central Command that the military is launching self-defense strikes against Iran, quote, in response to yesterday's downing of a U.S. Apache helicopter. The president telling ABC News that Centcom's response is, quote, very strong, very powerful. And Centcom did say that began at 5 p.m. Eastern time. So for more, let's get to our political panel. Megan Hayes is with us, Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Katie Frost, former executive director of the Georgia Freedom Caucus. Welcome to you both. Megan, if we could begin on Iran, as the president is really following through on what he said he wanted to see earlier today. He said there needed to be a response. Of course, we don't know what exactly this, quote unquote, proportional response looks like, but how easily could this spill into escalation that it seemed the president was going to great pains to try to avoid as he pushes for diplomacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a war that nobody wanted, and he got us into that we now can't. There's not an off ramp, right? We're allegedly in a ceasefire, which clearly is not true. So it does cause a great risk, but also our troops being in danger is never a good sign. So the sooner we can figure out how to get out of this, the better.
Did the president have any choice here, Katie, but to respond after what he wrote today? There are still questions about whether this was an intentional downing of the Apache helicopter.
Well, we're seeing conflicting reporting on that. Some people say it was a missile. Some people say it was an Iranian drone. But if American lives are at risk and that we are being attacked by our enemies, we absolutely have to make a response, especially when we're trying it. I believe its strength is part of diplomacy. You can't have to tell people you have to come to the negotiating table and then let them get away with launching an attack on one of our helicopters. So this is to be expected. And I think we can all agree we just want our troops to be safe.
Why keep calling it a ceasefire then, Katie? How about we just be honest and call it a war?
I think what the president called it was accurate. They asked him to define ceasefire, and he said, well, in that part of the world, it's just where you're firing at each other in a more moderate fashion. So everyone's definition of ceasefire is different.
Semantics.
Well, I wonder if it does make a difference, though, if we're considering the War Powers Act, as we consider semantics and definitions here. Do you think that this could help build the case even further on Capitol Hill after the House passed a war powers resolution last week? Is the Senate going to quickly follow suit?
I don't know if they'll quickly follow suit, but I definitely think it strengthens the case here. We have American lives in danger here with our troops being shot at now. And when the president is telling us we're in a ceasefire, which clearly is not true, then the Senate and Congress need to act appropriately. They are a co-equal branch of government, and it's about time they start acting like it.
Well, with war powers passing both chambers, what do lawmakers think about this ceasefire that appears to be a shooting ceasefire?
I mean, that doesn't even make logical sense what the president is saying. It sounds crazy to everyone except the president probably. But there needs to be something. There needs to be an off-ramp here. We are now in a war putting American lives in danger. And for what? And I think it's not helping the American economy. And we are not getting any further in a nuclear agreement. So I think that there needs to be some actual conversations here. And Congress needs to do their job and act here. And they have a check on the executive branch, and they are not doing that. And part of the War Powers Act was their ability to do that, or their trying to do that, but they hold the power of the purse here. So they definitely can do things here that they should probably be taking more action and checking the president.
Well, as we consider what Congress is doing, Katie, we did just see, as I mentioned, the passage of the reconciliation bill in the House. This is money for ICE and CBP. This is supposed to be the big border enforcement win for Republicans, but it's a debate that got overshadowed by the ballroom and the anti-weaponization fund. Did Republicans kind of lose the plot here, even if they ultimately got to the finish line?
I don't believe they did at all. And if you look at it, we could have had this funding months ago, but Democrats kept dragging their feet, forcing this partial shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security at a time when, if you talk about our nation, we need to be on high alert with everything that's happening on the world stage. That was the last moment you want to be defunding the Department of Homeland Security. But that's what the Democratic Party did. They shut down, of course, shut down the DHS, for months. Remember all those long lines at TSA? Remember all the problems we were experiencing? It was because the Democrats were saying, we're not going to fund ICE. And what happened? It ended up being funded. So the Democrats have staged a multi-month temper tantrum. And for what? They absolutely didn't get a single thing out of the negotiations.
I don't know if it's possible for the minority to single-handedly shut down the government. Megan, you can frame that as you wish, but I wonder your thoughts on that. ICE still wearing masks? They can still knock down your door without a warrant. Was that worth it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it brought the conversations much to the forefront. I've said many times I don't think we should be shutting down the government without a way to reopen it. But I do think that Republicans did have, I mean, they went on recess. They actively delayed this vote more because they did not have the votes. And I think that they are in a tough battle here with some of these other things that Trump is trying to put forward as the weaponization fund and the ballroom and all this other nonsense. And all this is going to come down to the midterms, right? These are campaign ads that are going to be made. These battleground seats are now going to be much more in jeopardy for the Republicans than they were before because some of these really tough votes. So I think the Democrats did do what they needed to do to make it much more political. I don't necessarily agree that we shouldn't be defunding. We should not fund a government for politics, but that's what happened here.
Yeah. So the Democrats obviously were willing to take a stand over that issue and see a department shut down for a record length of time. Do you think they're as willing to allow government spy powers to go dark on Friday? Will they actually let FISA authority lapse in the name of getting Bill Pulte out as acting DNI?
I would really hope not. I think that is a bridge that I'm not sure the Democrats are going to be willing to pass or to cross right now. But I have seen some reporting that the White House is trying to make a more permanent solution here. I don't think that they thought through the Pulte nomination. I would just hope that the Democrats would not let our spy powers and 702 of the FISA Act go. But I mean, stranger things have happened. I just don't think that Democrats are going to be willing to do that.
Well, it's interesting. If the president showed up with a permanent or a long-term name a serious contender, would Democrats climb down on this and pass FISA?
They should, right? Yeah. You have to be a functional government and you have to work bipartisan. And sometimes you have to take someone that maybe not be the best choice. But the Senate did confirm Tulsi Gabbard, who wasn't qualified. Right. So as long as we're not confirming someone that has no intelligence experience at all, has already weaponized his own mortgage banking to go against people, I think that Democrats would be much more open to that. But there are some things here that need to be done bipartisan and things that are our national security that Democrats have to work with the Republicans to get done. And I do think that this is one of those things.
Well, how should we consider the fact that the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, had to go to the White House today to discuss this? Katie, is that not some kind of tell if you have the majority leader and the speaker both having to try to reason with the president on this one?
I would say it's more a sign of what's happening in the caucus. And if you've been paying attention to what happens in the Republican caucus over the last several years, FISA is always contentious. There are people in both caucuses, Republican and Democratic, who have serious concerns about how FISA is implemented. So it is one of those things that is largely bipartisan, but there's also bipartisan dissent. And you're going to have more conservative members of the Republican caucus that are not supportive of that. And they're going to want very specific protections in any kind of legislation they're going to vote for. So it's more of a Speaker Johnson going and saying, if you want me to get my caucus on board, here's what we're going to need the final bill to look like.
Do you want to see the president present another name, Katie?
Well, this, of course, is an acting. Let's be very important, and I know the acting's doing a heavy lifting there. But what is acting? We'll see. I'm looking forward to see who he nominates. There are a couple other positions that we're going to need to fill in the government, too. We also need a new labor secretary to be nominated. We have an acting labor secretary, and hopefully we'll be getting a permanent name there as well. But we will see. It is an important post that can't be left just open. We need to have someone there, whether they're acting or permanent. But the sooner we get a permanent placement, the better.
I guess we'll see. I also want to talk about the fact that it's primary day in 4 states, including Maine. And we don't have as much a question about the outcome of the Democratic primary in Maine. It seems pretty certain Graham Plattner will be the nominee to go against Susan Collins. But given everything that has come out in recent weeks about Plattner, how worried are you about his odds in the general?
I'm extremely worried. But the one thing that worries me even more is the way that the national Democrats are talking about this. I think that Democrats need to realize here that the majority of independent voters are women. And you have now just said we don't believe women. We are just like Republicans. Everything we've said before doesn't matter to us. And we've taken a stance here that I'm not sure we can come back from. So I'm not sure why the Democrats are hanging their hat on Graham Plattner when there are other seats that we could win the majority in Texas and Iowa, in Alaska, in Georgia, other places where if we hold on to seats or get flip them, they could win the majority. So I'm just not quite certain why some of these Democrats are taking this stance right now.
Well, we're getting a taste of what we're in for here in the general. The Pine Tree Results PAC, which is aligned with Susan Collins, is up with a 7-figure general election ad buy that's ready to go now. It's an ad called Read the Posts, and it actually shows women reading from Graham Plattner's old Reddit posts, some of which he did apologize for. They've already spent $4 million. Katie, how much more expensive is this going to get?
Going to be extremely expensive, yet it will not be the most expensive U.S. Senate race this cycle. When you look at the amount of money that's being poured into these races, the prediction right now is North Carolina will be the most expensive, between $600 and $800 million being spent down there. But it's going to be extremely expensive. Democrats think that they can pick off Susan Collins, but they thought that 6 years ago when the Speaker of the House, Sarah Gideon, was running against her. All the polling leading into the general election had Gideon leading outside of the margin of error, and yet Susan Collins was reelected. Susan Collins is someone who shows up and does the job and is dependable, and that is ultimately what the ethos of Maine is. It was really a stark contrast when the other night you had Graham Plattner giving an interview where he was having to explain all of this baggage, where he was having to explain what he had done to his previous girlfriends, when he was explaining about the Nazi tattoo, where he was trying to explain about the Reddit posts. And then on the other screen, Susan Collins was being honored on the floor of the Senate for the fact that she had taken 10,000 consecutive votes. In her entire time in the Senate, she's never missed a vote. Does that mean we agree with every single vote she's taken? I think Megan and I both have things that Susan Collins has voted on that we would disagree with. But you can't object to the fact that she is someone who shows up, does the work, reads the material, and she actually does her job as a U.S. senator, and that is refreshing. So when Mainers go to the polls, I believe they're going to go for something that's tried, true, and reliable. She is, if you will, the LL Bean boot of the U.S. Senate. They're going to really elect Susan
Even though the
Collins.
president continues to call her a rhino. Katie Frost and Megan Hayes, it's going to be a doozy of a fight in Maine, and we'll be tracking it for you. You can read much more about this in the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew on Bloomberg TV and Radio.